Welcome to Media and Monuments podcast, presented by Women in Film and Video in Washington, D.C. Media and Monuments is conversations featuring industry pros speaking on a wide range of topics of interest to media makers.
On this week's episode, we'll highlight a couple of great new programs to check out on Netflix. First up, Sandra Abrams talks with the two filmmakers behind The Martha Mitchell Effect, a documentary focused on the unlikely Watergate whistleblower.
Thank you for joining us. I'm your host, Sandra Abrams. In this episode, I'll chat with the two women filmmakers behind a new Netflix documentary on how a woman stood up to a power-obsessed president who demanded loyalty from his inner circle. This is not about the 45th president, but the 37th president, Richard Nixon. Friday, June 17th, marks the 50th anniversary of the Watergate Scandal. The documentary is The Martha Mitchell Effect. It tells the story about Martha, the wife of Nixon's Attorney General, John Mitchell, and how she called the press to tell about the Watergate break-in and what she knew. Thanks to archival footage and interviews, we learned the real story about how Martha was silenced and the meaning behind the term, the Martha Mitchell Effect. Anne Alvergay is the director of this documentary. She is an award-winning documentary and editor in New York. Her editing credits include Love Gilda, The Business of Birth Control, and Bully, Coward, Victim. Deborah McCutcheon is the co-director. She is an independent filmmaker based in Brooklyn, New York. Her most recent film credits include co-producer of The Booksellers, a documentary about the New York's rare book world. Welcome to Media and Monuments, Anne and Deborah. So I watched your film. I loved it. I was glued to my seat, but I'm also a native Washingtonian, so I went back and I said to my mother, do you remember when this was going on? And she said the only thing she really remembered about Martha Mitchell was that she was funny. So, and that's something you guys do talk about. So I guess since this is the 50th anniversary, why is Martha getting her due now? Is it because of the 50th anniversary or is there other things going on?
Thank you, Sandra, for having us. I think it's a combination of factors. Certainly, the 50th anniversary, but I also think we're at a time when we're looking back at history and who told history and looking at these sort of hidden figures, particularly in Watergate, when it was, we only know about all the president's men. We don't know about the women involved.
Right. I think women do get marginalized sometimes in history. So I'm glad that you're bringing this forth. I guess one of the things that you talked about in the film, you said this is a love triangle. And I saw it as Martha loves John, John loves Richard Nixon, and Nixon loves the presidency. So why did you think that it was a love triangle?
Well, it was really Nixon and Martha who were vying for John Mitchell's attention. And Nixon and John were incredibly close. John Mitchell was almost like a mentor to Nixon and really, owed him the presidency as a result of all of his contacts and such. And I think that they were all friends until they weren't. And then Martha really loved her husband. She would do anything for him, but she also loved the truth. And I think she was willing to speak out at all cost for that. And also she thought it would save her husband. I really think that that was her intention. Unfortunately, that's not what happened. And John Mitchell chose Nixon in the end.
That's true. So I guess I wanted to just ask about how did your partnership come about for this before you started this? If you could tell a little bit of that, because as you know, it's Media and Monuments. This is the podcast for women in film and video. And a lot of people work with different people, but maybe you can give some insight into that.
Anne and I have been friends for a very long time. This was the first time we worked together in a professional, creative way. And it was in big part a response to the 2016 election. And it's safe to say that we were both very devastated by the results of that election. And we're looking for a project to collaborate on, something that could comment on the current moment. And we both really love archival and archival films. So we were simpatico in terms of our style and our approach right away. So that's where the jump off point was really after the election. We had learned about Martha Mitchell. We started talking about her. We thought, what an amazing character. And She was such an entertaining figure, smart, funny, engaging. Like, there had not been a documentary done about her, which surprised both of us. So then we kind of dove in head first.
Yeah, I noticed that you have been primarily with documentaries. And I also know, and you also did a documentary about Roy Cohn as well. So I thought, oh, this seems to be your path and what you guys like. So you must have been amazed at the amount of archival footage that was out there when you saw that.
Yeah, I mean, there was definitely a lot of press interviews with Martha. Martha loved the press, and the press loved Martha. She was incredibly popular. She, as we talked about in the film, she was kind of the only one of that administration or affiliated with the administration that would actually cozy up to the press. So, yeah, I mean, obviously we always wanted more. We didn't have any home movies. We were really limited to her press interviews, but luckily she was a big friend of the press.
To treasure trove, I would say, compared to other people when you look back on what, when people are trying to do documentaries. And speaking of people trying to do documentaries, and because you have that phenomenal experience of doing them, it seems like they take a long time to get made. And so I read that you started this project in 2019, and then by 2020, you had a deal with Netflix. And I thought, I haven't done documentaries, but to me, that seemed like awfully quick. So I'm wondering if you could kind of give us a little backstory of how that happened, and is it a quick turnaround to get a deal like that?
It's generally not that quick. We feel incredibly fortunate and incredibly lucky because it's so difficult to get documentaries made and to get them funded. At the same time, we also know that we had a great subject and we had access to materials and access to interviews, and we knew that we could tell a really great story. So in terms of, we actually pitched this to quite a few different places, but ended up going with Netflix because they are the best fit, and they've been incredibly supportive and really wonderful to work with. But it was a short that we made, so that typically is a little shorter of a process in terms of the production. And because we were doing all archival and recording original audio interviews only, we weren't doing camera setups and that type of thing. Maybe our schedule was a little bit accelerated because of that. But yeah, so I think the 40-minute length really lent itself to a shorter schedule. But otherwise, these things could take years. And we're fortunate and glad that it did not take years and years to do.
Well, speaking of the archival footage, and I know, Anne, you have a background in editing. How did you go in and you say, okay, I want this picture, this picture, this picture? Like, how did you decide, on what you wanted to put in terms of archival footage?
Well, we first, did a lot of research together to find what we could. I mean, it was vast. Particularly Deborah did a really deep dive and found some great gems in local stations with journalists. We found a journalist who found an interview in his attic. And then I basically kind of just strung it out, so it was a very, very long assembly to begin with. And we wanted to figure out what stories we could tell, what plot points we could tell. I mean, there were, her story is vast and it's incredibly inherently dramatic. So there were a lot of ways to go, but we were obviously limited and constrained by the archival. We also wanted her voice to lead it. So we were limited to what Martha was telling us and what her story was. I mean, there's a lot of different versions of her story, but we wanted her to tell her story as much as possible. Luckily, we were able to have some contemporary interviews to help contextualize her story, but those actually kind of came in later. The first part was trying to lead with the archival, see what we have, and then we went back to get the interviews.
I noticed that you had Connie Chung, and she obviously is a local hero here. You just said those came in later. So did you have in mind having those interviews when you first started to think about this project, or you said it came in later? Was that because you wanted it later and you wanted to do it? How did that, at what point did you say we want these interviews of people who were covering this story then?
I think we always knew we were going to need some contemporary voices to contextualize her story, because she just does not tell her whole story, unfortunately, with the archival that we had. And we also sort of liked that idea of bringing in these voices now, sort of reflecting back on that period. Although I know it's sometimes hard to tell if they're archival interviews or if they're contemporary interviews. There was an interesting sort of perspective that was happening with that. I think it just took a long time to book them. I mean, some of them were harder gets than others, I mean, we started with, certain players in the administration, Dwight Chapin, Bob Woodward, took a long time to get. Connie Chung had to be convinced. I mean, we were able to interview. We were able to interview
her interviews.
Yeah.
She's amazing. We first interviewed her husband, Maury, who had this great Washington show called Panorama.
Yeah.
Yeah. In the 70s.
I remember that show.
Yeah. Where everybody who was anybody, I guess, was on that show in Washington. And he was an amazing interview. And, but we really wanted some more female journalists. And finally, Connie Chung relented. And she was great.
Yeah. We also knew that we wanted primary sources, people that were there, people that had met Martha or who had interfaced with her. So that was a big strategy that we followed in terms of interviewing people and finding people to contribute who are contemporary voices.
Was there any point where you go, okay, we have all this free footage. At what point did you say, oh, we have to start paying for footage? We have we have a lot of documentary filmmakers, and that's the thing where, oh, I could do such and such, but I have to pay. Like, how did you go about? Did you have okay, we've got enough money set aside to do this, and what was that process like?
That's initially why we started looking for distribution, is we realized we couldn't fair use all the material. We couldn't get, what we needed all in the public domain, from the Nixon Library of Congress. So there was a seminal interview, the David Frost interview with Martha, which was a month after, in September 74, after Nixon resigned. And there was no way we were going to fair use that. So we realized we had a really great topic on our hands and we needed to expand out. And so we started getting screeners and realized we were going to have to up our budget.
Right. And then Nixon went on David Frost and said, oh, well, Martha was the problem all along. And I guess that part isn't really known, that because it wasn't highlighted. So because of that. So what part of putting this film together, and you had it and you said, oh, this is going to be great. We're ready to go to Netflix and show them this. We've got X, and this is the magic sauce right here.
I would say that particular bite that we found from David Frost, we knew that there was something there, that they were foils, that there was a battle that was going on between Nixon and Martha, and that was really interesting. And we started to dig into the White House tapes and realized that Nixon and Haldeman talked about her all the time, and that they had actually orchestrated a gaslighting campaign against her when she was speaking out at Watergate or during the break-in or right after the break-in. And it doesn't come out in the film, but Nixon was more worried, or he was more worried about Martha speaking out than the actual break-in and the ramifications to him, a few days after the fact. We cut together a pretty solid trailer with elements of those factors. And I think that's what sold it.
It seems like, she was at the time, women were to be seen and not heard, just like children were to be seen and not heard. That doesn't seem like it would happen today, but it does seem like the gaslighting is still going on. Have we learned anything, or is it because, thanks to social media or more news networks, people willing to speak out, women are not being silenced?
I feel like we have more vehicles for communication from civilians, right? From Twitter to Instagram to Facebook. And yeah, those are all devices, I guess, to call people out in the ways that they need to be called out. But I don't think that, I think gaslighting still continues, of course, behind closed doors, unfortunately.
Yeah, I would argue that the previous administration gaslighted the entire country for 4 years. So it's still, it was happening a lot. Still happens.
Well, especially now that we have the January 6th committee hearings. And again, they're taking their playbook from what happened in Watergate and putting those hearings out. And I do remember as a kid coming home and seeing the hearings, but what I remember is John Dean's wife sitting there. And I thought, oh, she's so glamorous looking. But I was a kid, what did I know? I didn't really quite comprehend what was happening to the country at that point. But it does seem like there's the parallel.
There's so many parallels, right? From the gaps in these phone call tapes. And yeah. I mean, we could go on and on.
I want to talk to you. I saw that there was a lot of buzz before you went to Sundance. I don't know, maybe you've been to Sundance before. So, this was old hat, not a big deal. But I was like, wow, you went to Sundance and it seemed like everybody was, couldn't wait to see your film. So what was that experience like for you?
Well, we actually did not go to Sundance physically because the festival got canceled. The festival happened, but in person was canceled. So it was a purely virtual festival. So we did go, quote unquote, to Sundance virtually. So we experienced it all through our laptops. But there was a lot of excitement about the film, and a lot of people really did want to see it. And a lot of people actually did watch it virtually. And we got great feedback coming out of it, the festival. That was our premiere. And it was a great way to sort of kick off the whole run of this film. And Sundance was really great and incredibly supportive. And it was a wonderful experience despite being virtual. And I had been there in years past in person, and it would have been great to go in person, but just have to make another film and get there in person.
That's right. Make another film.
Yeah.
I'm with you on that. What do you hope people take away about Martha, in watching this film? Any one thing or a couple of things, or just overall how women are treated in general?
I hope people come away from this film wanting to have conversations that may have been difficult to have previous to seeing the film. I hope that maybe people from opposite ends of the political spectrum can find commonality through Martha's story, because she is such an interesting figure and I think really appealing to a broad spectrum of people. And maybe she can help people have conversations about politics and gaslighting and all of these themes that are really resonating in the film and still today.
Yeah, I think ultimately, we want people to believe women, right? We want people to not take what the press or institutions of power say about other people because they could be, discounting them for political reasons, to listen to people and listen to all voices.
Thank you, Anne and Deborah. Congratulations on all your success. You can catch the documentary, The Martha Mitchell Effect, on Netflix starting Friday, June 17th.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Sandra.
Up next, Tara Jabbari sits down with Adam Conover to talk about his hybrid comedy documentary series, The G Word, that delves into the many ways the government affects our lives.
Thank you, Adam Conover, for coming on Media and Monuments. I'm Tara Jabbari, one of the co-hosts and co-producers, and I've got to watch The G Word. So I wanted to ask, first of all, it's quite interesting, the partnership, because one of the producers, and he appears in the documentary series, is a president or former President Barack Obama. How did you get in touch with him and some of the other people that have been involved?
This show came about because, well, first of all, in late 2018, I read the Michael Lewis book, The Fifth Risk, which is about how the federal government works. And I thought the book was fantastic. I was like, oh my gosh, I would love to do some of these stories on TV sometime. About 8 months later, I got a call from my manager saying, hey, I don't know if you're going to be interested in this, but Barack Obama's production company has optioned the rights to this book, The Fifth Risk. Do you want to go pitch on it? And I said, well, yes, of course I do. And I pitched my angle, which was that I would do it using my signature blend of comedy and, investigation and, television making. And they liked the pitch, and we brought it to Netflix where Higher Ground has a deal, and the show went on from there. Now, I made it very clear to them at the beginning that I had to have editorial independence in the making of the show, and that I couldn't be seen as a Obama administration or Obama political organization mouthpiece, or the show would have no credibility. And they granted me that, and that is how we made the show. And we ended up doing a bunch of segments on the show that are critical of the Obama administration, of different decisions they made, et cetera. But, they're all very well-founded in the facts, and they very graciously gave us the space to do that.
I didn't know that Obama was involved until the very beginning of the episode. And I'm like,
yeah.
I always get hesitant because we do want, especially in a documentary or something that talks about such important things like U.S. government, to not have a bias on stuff. And I do appreciate you guys kind of dissecting the different administrations on how things started and moved forward or fell apart or something like that. And then at the bottom of the screen, you will make a note of where you're getting certain statistics and things. So that was a really great job of not just transparency, but it'd be like, you don't have to be an Obama fan to watch this show. Please, you don't have to. I don't want you to be necessarily. I want you to know how our government works.
Yeah. Look, the show wouldn't have existed if Barack Obama had an option. That book, and if you didn't have a deal with Netflix, that's sort of the conditions under which it were made, right? In the same way that when I was making a television show for True TV, I didn't have control over the fact that there was advertising during the commercial breaks, right? But all we can try to do is try to create that separation, that zone of independence that, any, say, newspaper needs, right? To separate the newsroom from the advertising department, that sort of a separation. And then, the citations are there to show people, hey, we did our research. Here's where the information comes from. If you don't believe us, take it up the New York Times, take it up the Wall Street Journal, take it up with Bloomberg, whoever it was who we cited, take it up with the academic department, with UCLA or whoever it was that we cited. When you're transparent about it, the audience is smart enough to follow along with you and decide whether or not you have truly been honest. The alternative would have been, hey, let's not talk about that at all. Let's not put Barack Obama in the opening scene and just have his name in the credits, right? But the audience would have seen that and gone, hold on a second, Barack Obama's name is on this. Wait, does that make the rest of the information suspect? But by being transparent about it, we can remove those questions or at least answer them as the audience is having them.
Yeah, it was like another form of citation. You're like, he is involved. So let's just put that out there. It is mentioned a couple of times in the series that you guys were postponed because of COVID and lockdown and stuff. Was there ever a time where you were a little concerned of like, will this even get done?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I mean, throughout COVID, networks took COVID as an opportunity to cancel shows that they were in production on because they were able to use it as a force majeure and get themselves out of contracts they didn't want to be in rather than have to pay out the talent or the union workers. They were able to say, force majeure, we don't need to pay anybody. So, this happened to, for instance, Drunk History, which is a show that is also, I wouldn't call it comedy documentary, but it's comedy information in the same way my work is. And they had written an entire season of that show and were just about to shoot it. They were literally had cameras practically rolling, and Comedy Central canceled the entire show in the middle of production because they were just paused because of COVID. And Comedy Central said, no, we're pulling the plug on the whole thing. So, it was a bloodbath out there. And if it weren't for the folks at Higher Ground fighting for the show, could have happened. I'm not going to say there's no way to say that it would have or not, but, it was certainly a frightening time in a lot of ways. I mean, that was honestly the least way that it was frightening.
Yeah.
But I did count myself extremely lucky to still be working through the pandemic. The shutdown happened a week into our writer's room.
Oh, gosh.
And so we went from working in a writer's room to working over Zoom, and we had to write the entire season that way. And it was extremely challenging to do so. But at the end of the day, I was like, hey, at least I'm working. I have so many friends who are out of work now, who are at home with nothing to do but drink.
And that was one of the episodes, the money one with the daycare. Yeah. Even though they were an essential worker because their clients were essential workers, it still wasn't able to succeed.
Yeah, it's a really sad story. These daycare owners in Los Angeles, Sandra and Claudia, who have a daycare in South LA, in a disadvantaged area where, the folks that they are serving are people going to work at grocery stores, people working in healthcare, nurses. They're essential to the essential workers because they're taking care of those people's kids. They provided infant care at this daycare, which is very rare. And they received a total of, I think they said $6,000 in PPP loans, not even a month's salary for their staff. Whereas, the various production companies that I work with on this show received much more because, we have, as I say on the show, fancier accountants at bigger banks. It's completely unfair, but that is how our government chose to dole out the money, which is something that we criticize very harshly on the show.
Yeah, and thank you for explaining that daycare thing for people who haven't watched it yet. So when I was watching it, I was like, it doesn't surprise me that a fancier corporation that had bonds or more money could get more loans versus an independent business, right? Even though it is arguably more essential or is still an essential, we're like, I know. So it's hard to make it. But when they say, well, this is more New York, but I think it's like America. They're like, if you can make it here, you can make it anywhere. kind of mentality, but it is not easy, even for Americans. So it was just sort of, do you have an idea after speaking to those who are trying to make changes or are workers, something of hope, but also it is our system. So
I mean, well, look, first of all, the rich get richer is the way of the world. It's a law of nature, right? That if you have more resources, you are able to use those resources to get more, gains to you, to pull more proceeds, to pull more spoils to you, right? If I've got $1 million to invest in the stock market and you have $100 to invest in the stock market, who's going to make more money, right? It's just that's how the world works. But part of the point of the show is that the government is one of the only organizations that is able to counteract that trend and able to, for instance, focus on public goods that everyone is able to share equally, such as we talk about on the show, weather predictions, such as deposit insurance in the bank, etc. Now, that doesn't mean that the government isn't subject to that same force that causes those with more to be able to get more to them, right? For instance, those big corporations who are able to say, is the government's handing out PPP loans, the government's handing out money right now, well, let's make sure we get more than our fair share of that, right? Those people will always exist. Or the private business that tries to take that public good and turn it towards private ends, like AccuWeather is doing to the National Weather Service. Those always exist. However, it is our duty as citizens to try to fight back against that and to be constantly vigilant over our government and make sure that it is not being perverted towards those ends, because that's really the only structure that we have. As for whether or not I have hope, I do, because our entire final episode is about change and is an attempt to answer the question, how do we change our government when it is not serving us, when it is failing in the ways I just described? And how do we do that when it's so big and we're so small? And we end up talking about local government and the importance of local government and how we can make much larger changes in our government when we work on the local level. That, your donation, your door knocking, your activism goes 100 times further. The national election, the national government gets so much attention and our local governments get almost none.
That was my biggest takeaway from just like watching the whole show, but particularly the last episode. I was like, the big thing is we need to know as citizens that we do have a possibility to have a say locally, and that is just as important as nationally. And oftentimes, unfortunately, that gets ignored. So I really liked that a big chunk of that, particularly the last episode, talks about it. And one thing that I noticed, there's a sort of a skit where an elderly woman's like, the young people don't even vote locally. You should be paying attention to me. And the young people are like, what's going on? And I said, I feel like that also shows we need to work as a community and listen, because everybody has their own, they're thinking of what their needs are, but also the community's needs. So if we listen to each other versus fight each other, possibly we can start progressing. It will take longer and it's more frustrating at times, but it was getting involved locally as well as nationally, and working with and consulting with all forms of different generations and different backgrounds, we can start making a better change.
I agree with that. I also think that people who until now have not spoken up locally need to begin to do so. I mean, the squeaky wheel gets the grease in local politics as much as anywhere else. And the people who've been speaking up are the old, wealthy homeowners who don't want anything to change, right? For instance, in Los Angeles, where I live, there's a big effort to try to get renters more involved in local government, because homeowners, once they buy a home, they settle down, they're worried about their property values. They're the people who go and yell at the city council, right? But renters, there's far more renters, and renters need more help because they are living more precariously, right? And it's sort of, honestly, especially in our cities, despite the prevalence we give to homeowners, renting is like the more important mode of housing in a dense city. And so there's been a big effort to get renter issues elevated, right? To have renters show up at those meetings and say, hold on a second, build apartment buildings. You know what I mean? Like, please offer rental assistance instead of just bailing out, people who have mortgages, right? And so, making sure that we speak up is incredibly, incredibly important.
And my last question is, what is your hope that the audience's biggest takeaway will be after watching the series?
Honestly, it's to have them think a bit more critically about the world around them and about the government that, supports their lives. I mean, we have such a narrow political conversation about government in this country. We argue, as I say in the show, for 4 years, but who's going to run a government almost none of us know anything about. And so we don't know to safeguard what we need to safeguard, and we don't know to change what needs to be changed. And making people realize, hold on a second, this stuff really does affect you. You should care about it, and you can have an influence on it, will hopefully make a big difference.
I do want to leave you with this personal experience that I was working at the Georgetown University's School of Foreign Service Career Center. And when the U.S. elections of 2016 came out, the president of School of Foreign Service asked me, because I was in charge of the Twitter, to tweet it out and to make sure it gets quite a bit of coverage, because they started to notice a lot of students, undergraduate, graduate, and so forth. So young people were really disheartened by the election results. And his letter was basically summing up that saying, remember, you want to work for the people. The president changes every 4 to 8 years. Your career will be for the next 50 years. And even if you will not always get the president that you voted for, and that's okay, because if you have a difference, you can also be part of the discussion to help the president as well, because all of you are working for the greater good and the people. So don't let this be a discouragement. And I always appreciated that, because it was tough. I mean, I was a little older, and because when you're in a university campus, everyone's like voting for the first time, and they're like, damn it, it's not who I wanted. And it's just, and I do think a part of it is a little bit of being in this digital age. We can customize so much of our lives. If you want a purple phone, you can. If you want, something to order, Grubhub's a second away, that kind of thing, that it's hard to realize you can't control everything and you won't always get what you want. So I really liked that. I don't know if you have any thoughts, but I felt like your documentary also touched on that and be like, remember, the people who work in the government are still the people. So we're all not perfect, but we can still work together.
Yes, it is one of the real purposes we're trying to get across in the show, is to let the audience know the government is made up of people, right? People like you and me. Everybody is a person, and for good and for bad. Every problem that is caused in the world is caused by people. Every solution in the world is caused by people, right? It's not malign forces from space, right? And that's thing number one. Thing number two is I really try to reinforce with folks that no matter how bad things get, there is always something you can do today that'll create a better tomorrow, right? There's something that you can do. You can wake up and say, well, I can do my bit today, and your bit doesn't even need to be that much, but you always have that option available to you. And if you want to see that as a duty, which I do, you always have that duty every day, no matter how bad things get. And that to me is an antidote to sort of the apocalyptic doom-laden thinking that we've had over the last couple of years.
Well, thank you so much, Adam, for speaking with me. And everyone should check out The G Word on Netflix, out now.
That's it for this episode and for our inaugural season of Media and Monuments. We'll return in a couple of months with fresh new content for Season 2. But in the meantime, check out our Season 1 episode archives. You'll find lots of interesting and informative content in episodes that range in subject matter. And during the season break, our very own podcast team will help you pick some great ones to listen to again in mini episodes called Producers Picks.
Thank you for listening to Media and Monuments, a service of Women in Film and Video in Washington, D.C. Please remember to review, rate, and subscribe wherever you listen to this podcast. For more information about WIF, please visit our website at WIF as in Frank, V as in Victor.org.